St. Peter's. I've come back to 3H to read you the last chapter of our book, The Legend of Kevin. We're up to chapter 9 and it's called Kevin Flies Home. The flood left everyone with loads of clearing up to do. Even Max's family, who had not been flooded themselves, were busy helping their neighbours. But it turned out that the mermaids had all been very honest about paying for all the stuff they had taken whilst the shops were underwater. On the morning after the flood, Max's mum and all the other shopkeepers found their tills were stuffed with money. And it wasn't just the usual sort of money. The mermaids had taken it from the treasure chests they'd found in shipwrecks way down under the ocean floor. There were rare gold coins and precious stones and bits of antique jewellery. It was worth so much that it paid for all the repairs and all the redecorating. Quite soon, all the shops were back to normal, with one exception. Mum's hairdresser salon had been such a hit with the mermaids that she asked Dad to waterproof it and fill it with water again. If you have a look, it's now called Bubble Cuts. By the time he finished, it looked like a great big fish tank. There was a pipe leading to the river so that mermaids could swim in whenever they needed a new trim or a hairdo. Mum soon got used to putting on her diving suit each morning before she went to work, and everyone in Bumble Furred liked to peek in through the window as they passed to watch Poppy at work. Max was worried at first that the sea monkeys would stay behind and make trouble, but when the water drained away, all the sea monkeys were gone. Oddly enough, Mr. and Mrs. Brown's camper van was also missing, stolen from their parking space outside the flats. So if you should ever happen to see a rusty old camper van that looks as if it's full of water and there are little grinning faces in the windows and a lot of giggling coming from inside, it's probably best to stay well away from it. As for Beyonce and Neville, the brave guinea pig explorers, when the water level dropped, it turned out that their new land of Guinea Pigia was just at the top of the park keeper's compost heap. Ellie Fidget found them there on the morning after the flood. She took them home, where they started writing a book all about their adventures. Max and his school friends had a brilliant time during the clean-up. They went round with spatulas, carefully peeling left-behind starfish off the shop windows and plopping them into buckets of seawater. Then they took turns riding to the beach on Kevin and putting the starfish safely back into the sea. Everyone was so grateful to Kevin and Max for their hard work during the flood that the mayor gave them each a medal. She said it would be all right for Kevin to live on Max's roof if he wanted to, so he did. Dad put up some new plants and planted plenty of grass in them, and Max made sure his friends had a steady supply of biscuits, not just bourbons, custard creams, pink wafers, but also ginger nuts and digestives, and those little ones with a bright red blob of jam in the middle. At last, there came the sad day when the school was ready to reopen, and a school is no place for a flying pony. Each morning, Max had to say goodbye to Kevin and to go off and do his lessons. He did his best to concentrate all day at school, but the only thing he could think about was getting home to Kevin and going for a quick fly around town before it got too dark. One evening, when he went up to the roof after school, he found Kevin standing near the railing, looking out at the sunset. His tail was drooping, his ears were drooping, and he looked like a very sad pony. Gordon, who had come up to feed his pigeons, said, "The pony there is pining for his own home." "But this is Kevin's home," said Max. "He lives here now with me." "He is a creature of the winds and of the wet wild hills," said Gordon. "Maybe he doesn't want to live in a town. Maybe it's time you helped him to find his way back to where he really belongs." Max went and stood beside Kevin, and together they watched the sun go down. Somewhere in those evening hills must be the place where Kevin came from, Max thought. Somewhere up there, he had to have his nest, and maybe friends too that he was missing. "Do you want to go back there?" he asked. "Do you want to go home?" "Home," Kevin agreed. Max wanted to say, "You mustn't go." He wanted to say, "I will miss you too much." But he thought Gordon was probably right. It wasn't fair to keep a magical creature like Kevin on the roof of a tower block. However much it hurt, and he knew it was going to hurt a lot, He had to let Kevin go. "You could just fly there, couldn't you?" he asked, trying not to let his voice go wobbly. "Don't know where," said Kevin, and shrugged his wings. When the storm plucked him out of his nest, he had been too busy flying to pay much attention to where the wind was blowing him. The wild, wet hills of the outermost west were a very big place. He had no idea how to find his way back to his own nest. Also, he knew he would miss all his new friends in Bumble Furred, especially Max. But the autumn winds were calling to him, and he did so want to see his own tree again and sniff the familiar smells of the high hills and the open moors. Max turned away for a moment and wiped his eyes. Then he turned back to Kevin and he took a deep breath. "I'll take you home," he promised. And he went very sadly back downstairs and he told Mum and Dad and Daisy what they had to do. The next weekend, they all got into the car and drove west. Kevin flew above them most of the way, except sometimes he sat on the roof rack to give his wings a rest. Along the big roads they went, and then the middle-side roads, and at last they were on the tiny bendy roads like tarmac ribbons, which grew steeper and steeper as the car wriggled its way up the wet hills. The air was cleaner there, and the wind was full of the smell of the moors and the wild western sea beyond. Kevin took off and soared, spreading his wings, circling higher and higher until he could see the hills laid out below him, just like a map. He couldn't see his nest, though, so he came back down and had a picnic with Max and Daisy and Mum and Dad. Then they drove on a little bit further, and Kevin tried again, soaring up, 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 but he still couldn't see his nest. So they drove a bit further, and then Kevin flew up for a third time, higher than ever, until the car looked just like a toy on the ground below. And there, beyond the road, across the white rushing river, behind a rocky outcrop, was one of the very highest of the wild wet hills. And there he saw his own dear tree and the remains of his nest. He let out a happy neigh. When Max heard it, he felt terribly happy because he knew that Kevin had found his home. He also felt terribly sad because it meant that Kevin would be leaving. Kevin came swooping down again. He hovered just above the car, ruffling Max's hair with the flapping of his little wings. He reached out his velvety nose and nuzzled Max's face. "Bye, Max," he whinnied, and Max fed him one last custard cream. Then Kevin flew right around the car 3 times, did a loop-the-loop, and flew away. Max shaded his eyes against the evening sun, and he watched until Kevin looked no bigger than a bird. He watched until Kevin looked no bigger than a bee, and then he watched until Kevin vanished completely. And even then, he kept on watching, just in case Kevin changed his mind and came back. But Kevin did not come back. And after a while, it started to get dark, and Mum said kindly, "Come on, Max." And Dad said, "It's time we were getting back." Even Daisy was nice to him on the long drive home, but Max knew that it wouldn't feel like a home without a roly-poly flying pony. Back in his tree, Kevin carefully rebuilt his nest. He lined it with moss and lichen, and he snuggled down in it. He was happy to be back in his own hills. It felt good to be able to hear the wind blowing through the grass again, and the river laughing at its own jokes down in the valley, and the other nature noises, which were mostly drowned out by people sounds in Bumble Furred. "This is where I belong," he thought, tucking his nose under his wing and settling down to sleep. But something had changed. The woods and the winds and the water weren't enough for him anymore. He was missing something, and it wasn't just custard creams. He was missing his Max. Meanwhile, back in Bumble Furred, Max was missing Kevin just as badly. He tried to be cheerful about it and tell himself that he'd done a good thing by letting Kevin go back to the wild. But it had been so nice to listen to Kevin's little hooves clip-clopping about the roof, and the room seemed so very quiet without them. It had been so nice to wake up every morning and go running upstairs to see Kevin, and it was hard to get to sleep, knowing that you would never ever have that to look forward to again. Max felt as if there was a hole inside him, and it was a hole in the shape of a fat flying pony with very small wings. When he woke, the sun was shining through the curtains, and the birds were singing. Something was going clip-clop above his ceiling, and Max thought sleepily, Kevin's awake. And then he remembered that Kevin wasn't there anymore, and he felt sad all over again. Clip-clop went the noises. Clip-clop. Kevin, whispered Max, throwing off the duvet. Kevin, said Max, jumping out of bed. Kevin, yelled Max, running out of the flat and up the stairs, onto the roof, in his pyjamas. Kevin was standing on the roof, munching a mouthful of grass from the flower pots. He had made himself a big raggedy nest near the pigeon coop and lined it with moss and pigeon feathers. He had trouble getting to sleep too. He'd had a long think, and he had decided that now he knew his way from Bumble Furred to the wild wet hills, he could always go back there whenever he felt he'd like it, or when Max was busy at school. The rest of the time, he could live on Max's roof. He had decided that was home, and home was wherever Max was. But he didn't know enough words to explain that to Max, so he just said, custard creams. And that is the end of the legend of Kevin. I'm so pleased that Kevin and Max finished the book together, and I think it's a real tale of friendship and happiness, and it's one of my favourites. If you've enjoyed this story, there are more in the series. If you come and find me, then hopefully I can share the next book in the series with you and let you borrow it. Take care. Bye.